I wanted to just actually start by reprising this short essay that I wrote before, if I can figure out how to work this. No, I can't. Oh, what did I do? Which is the one? Oh, yeah. For Ada, the journal Ada, it's a non-APC, online, open journal of gender, new media and technology. It's for the issue 4, they're relatively new, on publication and its discontents, peer review publishing and the politics of the open. And the piece was, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Opening out from open access. So it's on writing and publishing in response to neoliberalism. Is Eileen connected? She can hear us. Yeah. So basically, I mean, I share with Eileen a sense of perhaps the increasing importance of writing as risk, as adventure. And for me, one of the reasons, well, there are a number of reasons for wanting to open out from open access, and they include wanting to get to, finding ways to get to some of the other sources of antagonism. For me, those are principally around citation practices, peer review, and free labour. So I want to try and get to those, but also to get to what might still be radical about writing. And for me, that has something to do with writerliness, and I'll try and explain. That's an extremely contingent thing, and I suspect I might be making it up. But writerliness has something to do with kind of going against the current grain of sort of rightness, which I'll try and explain in a bit. In any case, this essay starts with drawing attention to its writtenness. I have the same kind of response to reading academic work that I do to reading fiction. If it doesn't draw attention to its own writtenness, I become suspicious very, very quickly. And I'm writing a lot of short stuff these days, short essays and position papers and polemics and things like that. And I like doing it, and I like doing it partly because it does kind of really focus your mind very quickly on what it is you're trying to say, but also because it does draw attention to the process of writing. And of course, publishing digitally short pieces gives us an unusual opportunity to make timely, perhaps even relevant interventions and commentaries. And, you know, I'm kind of interested in the extent to which digital publishing, the return of earlier forms, right? Like the short essay, earlier forms that were once new, like manifestos, come back. The role of cultural commentary, even the role of the public intellectual, I think is kind of opening out again in this context. And that's not to big up my own part, but really to indicate what might be part of the wider remit of our publishing enterprises, various. Anyway, I go on to argue that here and now, in this context of academic capitalism, for me, I don't think there is anything that much more important than drawing attention again to processes, forms, formats, registers, tones, styles of academic writing, acknowledging, of course, that the relationship between writing, publishing, and marketization is at the very core of academic capitalism. Our output, as we know, as we've all been saying, is quantified, metricized, audited to death, almost, in academic environments that are, for me at least, no less differentiated than they ever were, that are increasingly competitive, that are increasingly corporate, that are in experiential terms. And I'm interested in who's writing about this right now. So people like Ros Gill arguing kind of unusually directly, and Carol Stabile extremely directly and passionately, that these environments are becoming unsustainable, and for some of us more than others. In our relatively recently privatized sector, this obligation, pressure to produce auditable output is, of course, one of the self-regulatory mechanisms that governs entrepreneurial academic subjects. And even for me, as someone who's kind of relatively critical of open access, it does seem perverse to put open access in that same context, although we know, of course, that Ref 2020 has already mandated, has already, to an extent, co-opted open access. So my reservations are really about the open access debate. You know, the practice that the Goldsmiths Press will have is very similar in effect to say, Joe's or other people's here. But it's the debate that's been worrying me in as far as it strikes me as being pretty ideologically polarized and totally asymmetric. I think in the worlds that I've been in, recently dominated by a policy-driven, top-down economic agenda oriented to the production of researchers' innovation. Right? And present company accepted, of course, I also hear a lot of a technological consensus, which for me tends to absorb what's left of any asymmetry. It's a danger very much of depoliticizing the debate, or at least of delimiting what we say and what we do with respect to writing and publishing. And my reasons for this, for having this kind of position, for making that kind of argument, is that I've been on this research consortium called CREATE for, I think it's 3 years now, it feels longer. And it's CREATE. So it's a centre for copyright/creativity, regulation, enterprise and technology. And this is looking at copyright reform in digital culture. There are a number of projects that are on publishing, ours is one of them, and therefore necessarily we're looking at the alignment between copyright reform and open access reform, between the Hargreaves Review of Intellectual Property and the Finch Report on Open Access. So I've been in this kind of policy environment reform agenda, listening to some fairly crass, but nevertheless potent arguments that are around technological determinism and progress that state very simply, but probably quite effectively, that policy and legislation around copyright and around access are out of date, are out of step with new digital technology that they must catch up and that they must keep up, otherwise be deemed irrelevant, obsolete, redundant, and nobody wants that, do they? This kind of simplistic narrative of catching up with technology is kind of compounded for me by an equally simplistic ontology of the digital as copying, as reuse, as sharing. And what those kind of combined stories do, to my mind, is further obscure more insidious underlying ongoing processes to do with privatization, to do with marketization in education and in the creative sector. So the reform of access becomes this kind of mechanism for recruitment to neoliberalism in as far as it unifies a top-down, policy-driven, bottom-up grassroots agenda through a consensus to catch up and keep up with new technology. So a model of access that is broken and therefore must be fixed is the one that worries me. As it becomes a centre ground, as it becomes some kind of common ground, and as it potentially then absorbs a politics of the open access movement, along with these other sources of antagonism that the open access movement attempts to reach, which has to do, as people have been saying, with peer review, has to do with citation practices, has to do with free labour. And all of these things for me are critical because they're becoming more differentiated and more conservative, not less. So, you know, as you may surmise, my goal is to an extent to try and dig those other sources of antagonism out. And that happens for me by opening out from open access, although I completely recognise that, you know, apart from the difference in tone perhaps, opening out from open access may well be one version of what radical open access actually is. So, you know, I fully recognise that that's kind of, you know, where there's probably more common ground than not, I think, in terms of the people who are coming up and talking critically or non-critically about open access. I mean, the goal that I think we share, or that I think I'm sharing with other people setting up or have set up publishers recently, is to repoliticise scholarly writing, is to repoliticise publishing, is to see it as a response to, as much as a mechanism of, neoliberalism, and to see what can be done, in a sense, in, you know, moving academic capitalism towards forms of academic activism, right? And I see elements of that in our attention to ethics in scholarly publishing. I've learnt a lot from Mattering Press in that sense. I see it too in our kind of renewed, endlessly renewed concerns with power and difference in academic life, and also with our ongoing attempts to retrieve, perhaps, but also rework ideas around invention, ideas around intervention, ideas around experimentation, as Janneke has done, that run against the grain of research as innovation. The ADA is rooted in a feminist collective called Fembot. I think it does its best to recognise these differential issues in peer review and citation and so on. In as far as it is any kind of a challenge at all to a neoliberal agenda, and I'm not sure they claim that much, I think it works not actually by seeing itself as a tool of opposition in a fight over access so much as by recognising, I think as Jo is also indicating, its own limitations, its own failures, its own accountabilities, its own responsibilities, as a sort of predictably underfunded project relying on the very forms of free labour that are of concern to it. I think it works for me, Ada, in as far as it opens up questions of access in relation to ethics, which has more to do with internal and external sets of relations, and in as far as it tries, even as it fails, to extend, expand, experiment with knowledge practices, with communication practices, in a context in which these are being increasingly shut down or closed down or made more conservative. I'm on the advisory team for ADA, on the advisory board, and I think probably in some ways the Goldsmiths Press does take its cue from their earlier, always provisional, always uncertain, inevitably faltering openings. Having said that, we will not be adopting ADA's model of open peer-to-peer review, lovely as it is. I think, you know, probably along with some others, we're looking at something more hybrid, a bit more streamlined, certainly a bit less free labour intensive, and, you know, pragmatic, perhaps, as much as it is politicised. I think one of the things that forces me to think quite radically in relationship to peer review is the sheer pragmatics of finding people to review anything anymore. And I think that might be driving me in directions, something I'd quite like to share with you in a bit. But, you know, it's a real struggle, the pragmatics as well as the politicisation of peer review. And I think they're both up, and I don't think any of us are necessarily going to have any answers here. But I think we're all kind of moving in similar directions, at least in terms of opening out. Peer review is a problem. And I think that's probably where we'll come in. We're not going to make huge claims. We will have a kind of hybrid open-closed system. People will have the option, they will have to have, I agree with Jo on this, of perhaps reviewing some stuff openly, but not always appropriate, not always possible, not always desirable for some reviewers. Our system will actually, I think, if we can get away with it, highlight and target, perhaps unusually directly, the increasing conservatism, especially masculinization of current citation practices. I feel very much inclined to take that on through the press. And what I'm hoping is that the material that we publish will not just, in a sense, correct for, if there is such a thing, current biases in citation. I will be looking at some degree of obligation to do that, I think. But what I'm hoping will happen, perhaps more, is that some of the work will begin to experiment with citation practices, even if the experiments themselves are not particularly new, and they're often not, right? So I can't really talk about anybody else's example at this stage, but in my own work, I've been reaching for some very old school strategies when it comes to citation. They have to do with irony, they have to do with parody, they have to do with satire even. So I've been playing with the idea of a girls' citation club. Feels fair to me. And actually, a piece I wrote relatively recently only stopped short of doing a Perec. That would be not just leaving out all the E's, but leaving out all the he's. I couldn't pull it off. It's very difficult. It would take me too long. But it's a great idea. You know, if only there were more time, I would do it. So in the conclusion, I've written this book on gender and smart media that should have been in February. But anyway, it'll go in. I've been looking at practices of knowledge, communication, that aren't just increasingly masculinized, but are also quite scientistic at the moment. So to my ears, out there at the moment, there's a lot of disingenuous declaration. I think there's probably one major disingenuous declaration, and it's something to do with the end of humanities, or the end of the human, or the end of man. I go to a lot of conferences in which certain speakers have dominated quite profoundly and then stand up and say, but it's the end of man. The end of man, say all the men. And I'm thinking, really? Is it, or is it just in my end is my beginning? It sounds to me about as disingenuous as writers writing about the end of writing. I'm a little bit tired of that too. So in and amongst all this apocalypticism, there's a fair amount of physics envy and biology envy and ecology envy. I hear it in some areas of media archaeology, media ecology, some areas of object-oriented philosophy, or OOPS thinking, as I now refer to it. And what I mean by all this is that there's a kind of renewed tendency to indulge in what the fabulous French feminist Xavier Gaultier referred to back in the day, this is back in the day, as that frightful masculine fashion of speaking in order to be right, brackets, how ridiculous, right? The ridiculousness of the claim to rightness in what we used to call phallogocentrism, and still should, right, was always challenged by an emergent, still emerging, I would have it, feminist tradition of writerliness. And so I see writerliness as the kind of constitutive outside, if you like, of all this rightness that's going on at the moment. And one of the things I hope for most for the press is that it will recapture a tiny bit of that tradition. I can't do it as a UP as evenly, as consistently, as impressively as Punctum Books, right? A press which, can I cite Eileen, back to Eileen again, seeks to curate the open spaces of writing, or writing as opening. I love that. It's going to be an aspiration for us. But one of the things we are getting is some pretty renowned sociologists and media theorists and the like, some of them male, writing anecdotally, polemically, creatively maybe, passionately for sure, about things like academic capitalism, kind of exchanging thereby perhaps a modicum, a quantum of rightness in favour of writerliness. The other thing that we can do as a UP, we're piggybacking the Goldsmiths prize. I've gone the wrong way again, sorry. This is not working. Sorry. Here we go. The Goldsmiths Prize is for experimental fiction, for experimental writing, and this is we're doing the app, so this is a bit extremely early mock-up, so don't read too much into it, but you can see that we can do some stuff with the two winners that we've had so far, Emma McBride, Ali Smith. We'll get a little bit of Emma's early manuscript that she had to change a lot for Gally Beggar, which will be interesting. We will have all the shortlisted work, a lot of information from the judges as well as the writers. And one of the things we're asking them for is their influential reads. So in other words, what we're going to do is start to generate a kind of Goldsmiths-based archive of experimental writing, of experimental fiction, and we will use that as a platform to start to commission as well as to reward experimental writing. So I'm kind of excited about that. There's other things that we're doing I'll be happy to talk about in a minute, but just to finish, the climate that we're in the climate that we're in, we're being told that scholarship is in crisis, that scholarship across the arts, the humanities and the social sciences is under threat, is in crisis. It's not an argument I subscribe to. My goal in my own work and through the press to as great extent as possible will be not to conserve an idea, a fixed idea of scholarship, but rather to complicate it further on the basis that scholarship, to my mind, was always already complicated. And not neatly sifted into categories of commercial and academic, or even mainstream and alternative, and certainly not, and this is where a UP may be able to do something, certainly not divisible into an idea of auditable research and that which is deemed beyond the pale. So that's one I think we can play with, and I think it's because Goldsmiths Press isn't independent, because it cannot be an outlaw. I think it's because of that rather than despite it that we might be able to contribute to messing things up a bit. Okay, I'm done.